flesh and blood. Skin and bone, a dream. I called home. The sun is hot, water is wet. Now remember, then forget. But how could I miss this? It's okay. Everything is fine. Gratitude is warm and kind, an open hand, a bird in flight, a gentle breeze on a windless night. Such a tender kiss. This. Earth and sky. Skin and bone, just when I thought I was alone, your light slices through everything I thought I knew. It's a song of bliss. This. Me and Francis were sort of asked to take a moment to sort of recount how we got connected with each other. So I thought I would just start with that really quickly. By the way, it's lovely to be here with you all. It's really, it reminded me it's been a long time since I've been actually in Berkeley again, so it's really nice to be back here with all of you. And last year, Rick from Boot at the Gas Pump called, I think. Rick Archer, yeah. And he wanted to do an interview with me and Francis, and we ended up at my house, downstairs, and doing a filmed interview. And I was told about Francis, and I looked him up on Boot at the Gas Pump, of all the places. Well, I wonder who this guy Francis is. And I went up and I watched the video of him being interviewed. And the thing that's struck me, not only at that time, but as we've gotten to know each other develop a friendship over the months, is one of the things I think that me and Francis really share. What I really appreciated about Francis is, well, number one, as I was telling somebody as we were walking back from dinner, that I have a soft spot in my heart for monks and old people. I don't know why.
And most monks are old people.
Yeah.
That works well.
Increasingly so, right? And so that was right there. He had the monk part covered, not the old person yet. But
I'm getting there.
Yeah, we're both working on that one. But I felt like where we really connected is, and where we really do connect is, well, we both came from sort of traditions, and in our own ways, we kind of are in some way operating to some extent outside those traditions. But I think we both have a real appreciation for sort of the inclusive view that a lot of ancient traditions hold. I think that's one of the best things they hold, is this large, inclusive view, at least in the mystical side of it. And it's a nice complement, I think, to a lot of the spirituality that we have now. You know, that is, I think, not only the spirituality, but the people who are engaged in it are really recognizing the value of a really inclusive, of spirituality and a spiritual kind of view and awakening that really includes the entirety of what it means to be alive, both the transcendent aspects and these very human aspects as well. And that's really, I think, one of the places that we've really resonated with each other. Yeah.
So is it my turn now?
It's your turn, my friend. I hand the ball over to you.
Well, yeah, I met Adya when we did the little interview with Rick on Jesus, on the Jesus book that Adya wrote. And Rick gave the book to me to read, and I ended up reading it like 4 or 5 times before we did the interview. And the reason why I kept reading it was because it just simply stated what was in my heart really about Jesus. I mean, I grew up as a pious Catholic kid, obviously going into a monastery at 22. I was pretty idealistic and pious and had a sense of Jesus early on in my life that was very theological. And then after a series of kind of openings, awakenings, moments of spiritual clarity that sometimes some came and visited and some came and stayed. And gradually my whole perspective on Jesus changed, and I began to sort of interiorize Jesus. It wasn't so much a figure that lived off in heaven or lived 2,000 years ago, but Jesus as a symbol of the self in my own heart that I had kind of awakened to. And so took on a whole different dimension. And the book by Adya really captured that for me in a really wonderful way. And he also had a connection with a probably little-known saint to people in this genre or atmosphere, which is Saint Therese of Lisieux, who was a Carmelite nun who lived at the turn of the century in France and died at the age of 24, I think, in a little convent in Lisieux, and had a little kind of mystical path that she followed that she called the way of spiritual childhood. And as you might imagine, it's a path of surrender, basically. Just loving surrender to God, or to an energy that she called God. We don't have to call God. God doesn't care what you call he or it or she or whatever you want to call that reality. But Adya had a kind of heart opening with Saint Therese, as I did as well, as a child even, and entered the monastery on her feast day. So there was a special sense of devotion to her as a saint in my life as a Catholic. And so there was immediately that connection. And then when we met, there was just a recognition of a brother, just obvious to me. And that's just only grown. And so I'm very, very happy and thrilled to be able to do this event with Adya and hopefully other events in the future. And because I really feel that there's one heart, and it's nice to be able to express that together and share our hearts that what's most important to both of us. So thank you for having this event and inviting me.
Yeah. I think one of the things too that that's really, well, it's been part of my experience, obviously, as you know, with taking forays into Christian mysticism throughout my whole life, actually. At the same time as sort of being a card-carrying Buddhist in my 20s and 30s, and I think it really pertains to sort of modern-day non-duality. And I think that's one of the important things that I want to bring out is I think what I encounter, and I think you've encountered quite a bit, is that that one of the things, each teaching, each system, each different way of going about it has strengths and weaknesses. And whether it's Buddhism or Christianity or Advaita or whatever it is, they all have their strong points and they all have their weak points. Those things that are really highly developed and those other parts that aren't quite, either not developed or at whatever current time we might be in, they're not particularly emphasized. And I think one of the things that I've seen being around sort of the non-duality scene for almost 19 years now is this great evolution, actually. When I started to teach, if I taught about anything other than basically that you have a moment of awakening and that's it, and you hoist your enlightenment flag and that's done and that's all it is. When I tried to talk about that when I first started teaching, forget it. Nobody wanted to hear it. You could feel this visceral, energetic, no. Leave, we don't want to hear this right now for the most part. And so I remember thinking, okay, well, that's fine. I'll get back to that some year. And, I kind of did other things, taught other things, and then about 5 years later I came back and there was a change. And that change, certainly over the last 12 years since then, has, I think, really, really grown, where, everyone's individual and very, very unique in their own experience, but what I find is there's two things that really stick out to me in sort of non-duality is, obviously, some of the pointers are extraordinarily powerful, extraordinarily strong, and I think that's what's resonated in large extent with American culture. It's very strong, these pointers, and it's rational. You don't have to believe some story, whether the story's of any tradition, it has a rationality to it. And yet, I think the other side of it, for as powerful as it is that it can leave people without a really developed spiritual heart. I meet people all the time. They go, I know what emptiness, I've had some awakening to pure awareness, and I get the, and yet there's some sense of there's got to be something more. There's an intuition that there's some quality, I think, of intimacy, of closeness with existence that is often, certainly I get asked a lot about it, and I imagine you do too. And I think that's one of the things I think is really changing. It's really growing. A real receptivity to a bigger sort of embrace than just the strictly sort of transcendent realms of spiritual revelation, And which is, of course, what I've loved about the Christian story. Not necessarily the theology, but actually the story is so richly textured, right, with transcendence and very gritty human, even difficulty, to the point of despair at times. And it embraces this very, very broad spectrum of the human experience. And I think that mirrors what most human beings are looking for. is some way that embraces the entirety of the human experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the human heart just kind of knows, I think, that there's more to life than the human experience. To begin with, there's something that compels us to look beyond this humanity that we all experience, this personality, this person, this conditioning, this set of conditioning, this background, gender, whatever. You know, there's something innate, I think, in human beings that we just know on some level, there's got to be more, there has to be more. And so we go on this search. And before that time, we're pretty convinced that all there is this. All there is this body, this mind, this world, and navigating it. You know, and so we kind of do our best to do that. Our parents do their best to prepare us to do that. You know, most of our parents, through no fault of their own, are not two enlightened Buddhas, for the most part. A few of the lucky ones have a few. There are a few parents out there that are, probably. But my parents, as good as they were not. So, and they did the best they could to try to get me to learn how to navigate this life. But eventually, with some luck and some grace, we come across a teacher or a teaching that points to something beyond. And so we look for that, we look to that, we yearn for that, and eventually we maybe get at least a glimpse of that, you know, there's more to me than just this person that I thought I was. There's some dimension to me that transcends that, that's far beyond that. And yet, where is that dimension? It's right here. You know, it's not far away somewhere else. We don't get there by somehow losing our bodies or minds, do we? Hopefully. But it's found right in the heart of our humanity, you know, within us. And I think it's just something that we're so tied to, our human personality, our conditioning, our personal history, that when we finally get a sense that there's something more, it's so liberating. We were talking the other day about how when you come into this sense that I do not have to perceive life through this filter of Francis or Adya or John or Mary or whatever your particular filter is named, you realize, you know, I don't have to look at it that way. There is a kind of pure consciousness, there's an awareness at the heart of this person that looks at it and is just present to it. Doesn't grab onto things, doesn't push things away. It's very liberating. But I think that initially in the spiritual kind of journey, what normally happens is rather than a deep, deep awakening to this pure consciousness, this pure presence, there tends to be an awakening from identification with the personal. It's we were talking about it the other day about just the witness consciousness, and Adya was speaking in his course the other night about observing, about the observer or the witness. And I know probably, I don't know, it was in my late 20s, I would say 28. There was a big kind of shift from perceiving things from a very personal perspective of Francis and how he saw things and what he liked and what he didn't like and so on. And the reality of that just became clear to me, that there's a way of looking at this that's free of a filter, that just observes, that just is witnessing what's arising and witnessing what's ceasing. And that can be very, very liberating, but it's primarily a disidentification. It's not so much the discovery of who we are on the very deepest level, but it's a disidentification from who we are not, at least essentially. Who we are not is this conditioning that's constantly in a flux, isn't it? Constantly changing in the course of a lifetime. You know, the way you perceive life as a 5-year-old and the way you perceive life as a 15-year-old and the way you perceive life as a 35-year-old, even from the perspective of personality, is almost like different incarnations, isn't it? So it's a constantly changing reality. But we get very identified with that. And so to be free of that, even for a glimpse, even for a moment, feels liberating, let alone if it's a more stable, abiding sense of the witness. But that witness consciousness in the course, in the journey of an individual, is not the whole story. You haven't scaled the whole mountain. You're maybe a third of the way up the mountain. You know, you're a little bit more free from what had bound you before, and yet you're not really abiding in your deepest identity, which is not a mere witness. Adya mentioned this the other day in his teaching as well. It's not a matter of just witnessing or observing. It's a kind of unconditional openness, an unconditional kind of benevolent regard, you could say. In French, they have the word regard, and it doesn't just mean looking. It kind of has a connotation of just like taking something in or regarding something. And there's something about this consciousness, there's a quality to it that's not clinical and cold and just detached, but is absolutely unconditionally open. So I think in the course of an individual journey, there is a development from a kind of detachment from the personality that then kind of cultivates, in a certain sense, a witness or an observer. And then there's a gradual maturing into the reality. The depth of that reality is that it's not just a mere witness. It's not just this sort of detached observing, but it's this regard. It's this loving embrace of what is. That's real kind of awakening to the self. That's this transcendent self that we all are already. And in the course of an individual journey, I think that is a normal development. And my sense is that in the non-dual movement, you could say, I don't ever know what to call it, but
that's pretty good. Movement.
Is it movement?
It'll work.
There also is a natural maturing that's happening. And I think it is more toward this deep, abiding sense of this unconditional openness, which is open to things like our humanity, the fact that we have bodies, in case you hadn't noticed, the fact that there's a whole world here that's in pain sometimes, and if we're really one with that, if the consciousness we are is not separate from that, then what does that do in terms of our heart response? You know, so I kind of see it as just a natural trajectory that has a personal kind of individual, you could say, expression, and a collective expression, and I kind of have a sense that's what's unfolding.
Yeah, I think there's a bigger collective sense of that same unfolding. Do you know? It's almost, I hesitate to say this because I usually don't think in these terms, but it just came to my mind. It's almost there's a feminine quality that's developing in it, because what you're speaking about is a revelation where you see, I mean, to put it one way, you could say you see the self in everything, or you see God in everything, or you see yourself in everything. The experience of that, however, is an experience of tremendous intimacy, which is what you're talking about. There's a tremendous intimacy, a closeness, a vulnerability, an openness, and these are, at least, you know, archetypically more feminine qualities. Transcendence is a very masculine quality. You know, to be wake up and out, and I'm not this, and I'm not that, and I'm, you know, the neti is a very masculine, I've always thought of it as a very masculine kind of quality, and I think not only as strategies or as teachings, but also within our experience, since we all ultimately embrace all the masculine and feminine qualities, I think it's quite natural that our own realization will eventually show all those qualities as well. Transcendence, very sort of masculine transcendence, and emptiness and nothingness and all of that, and that sort of very inclusive, soft and warm and rich and intimate, and which I think certainly I get I think that a lot of people are looking for that part of it, that real kind of truly, that paradox, right? Of being intimately connected or at one. But I always think, oneness is such an easy thing to say, at one with every da-da-da-da-da-da. But to me, like the experience of oneness is a kind of identity as everything, but it's also like a tremendous intimacy, no distance. I think that's more how it interacts probably at the human level. And I think that that there's a lot of people that I meet that are really looking for that quality also. And also that I think that implies a kind of engagement too, And yet it puts a lot of pressure, because to come out of just the witness position that you're talking about, it actually forces us to deal with our humanity. If you transcend it, you're just up and out and you have nothing to do with it as long as you can be up and out. But that's a dualistic experience at the end of the day. It's still dualistic, But I think something that comes back in, it includes the humanity, and then we run into whatever our unfinished business is. Emotionally, relationally, whatever thing, as that same energy is seeking to kind of really get in here. I've always seen that the waking up is just makes something possible. Waking up and out in transcendence, it makes possible the downward movement of spirit. It makes it more possible to kind of come back and re-embody. But of course that re-embodiment isn't quite as pristine as the awakening, nor does it happen like snapping your finger, And that's what I mean, going back 12 years ago, almost nobody wanted to hear any of this stuff, and now it's almost just the opposite, which I think is a really interesting development. And I think it's really quite heartening, and it's actually, it really shows of a maturing on a big scale of people's spiritual experience and where they're willing to open up to.
An analogy that kind of comes to me because, until fairly recently I was in a monastic community, so I didn't really have a lot of experience of current TV programming or whatever, and I still really don't. I don't watch TV really a lot, but I watch it some. And one thing I've noticed a lot of are reality shows, and which are really a kind of experience all their own that is... I don't know how much I would correlate it with the word reality, actually. Yeah. But that's what they're calling them. And I know one where they have at least one, I think they have several, that are focused on weddings and things around weddings and wedding planners and wedding dresses and wedding venues and this and that and the other thing. And I think a lot of people seem to be fascinated with weddings, and I thought, I wonder how many of them are fascinated with marriages, It's all well and good to have a nice wedding, but if the marriage sucks for air, then who cares?
And if you look at what most of those weddings look like in the reality shows, it doesn't look good for the marriage.
Yeah, probably not.
Does not look good.
Well, there's one called something about what is it called? Bridezillas. And it's all about these brides that are less than, let's say, edifying in their pursuit of the perfect wedding, let's say. So, but anyway, I think a lot of it with spiritual experience, sometimes we can be so focused on the wedding that we forget that there's a marriage that follows, And we can have all kinds of awakenings, any number of them. I was a monk for a long time, and I was involved not only in Christian mystical paths, but I went very, very deeply into Theravadan Buddhism in the Vipassana community. And I even ordained temporarily in a Theravadan tradition under Bhante Gunaratana, who was my preceptor. And so I went very deeply into that tradition as well. And it's very easy to sort of miss the forest for the trees sometimes. You get kind of enamored of some tradition, and you have all these visions of enlightenment, and you kind of think, oh, it's going to happen like it happened to the Buddha. I'm going to be sitting under a tree, and Mara's going to come and tempt me with all her daughters, and so on and so forth. But I'm going to stand firm, and in the end, I will be a Buddha. We think all these wonderful things, and we may have a lot of experiences. I did Vipassana intensively. I did a lot of Christian mystical practice. I did Zen that was a smaller amount, but that was like 10 years I did with 2 Zen masters. So for me, that was like a low-key thing. But the Vipassana I did for years and years and years, went on long retreats and so on. And sometimes we get so focused on some big bang experience, that I meet people today who they don't have a Big Bang experience, but they have some kind of clarity come to them. And it's so not Big Bang that they don't even realize it. They're talking to me and I'm thinking, well, there's some real wisdom here. There's some real insight here. There's some real clarity. And they're saying, I've been practicing for 25 years and I'm still not enlightened and I don't know what's wrong. And I think, well, I think there's been some awakening here. You seem to have clarity about this or that. You question them a little bit. But because it didn't fit their idea of what an awakening is, they've discounted even the concept that they might have had an awakening. But even if you have the most wonderful awakening, like we were saying the other day when we were talking, Monday morning after the retreat, the bell rings, time to get up, take a shower, go to work. Where's your awakening then?
Like you said, that's where the difference between the honeymoon or the marriage and the wedding and the actual marriage.
Exactly.
And they're definitely tied together, but they're not the same thing.
And there's nothing wrong with a honeymoon. Honeymoons are great.
Oh, heck
go to
no.
Hawaii, go to Bahamas.
Highly recommend them.
Yeah. I would
All
think,
kinds of honeymoons.
Yeah, sure.
Sure. We're having a honeymoon right now with our friendship, sort of. We'll see how the marriage goes later.
We could write a book about it.
Right.
After the bromance.
Right. But I think
a pre-bromance agreement.
Right. I think it takes a kind of maturity, though, to be able to, like it takes a maturity to go from, a wedding to a marriage. It takes a maturity to go from even profound spiritual experience or awakening into what comes after that. Because that's its own unfolding. That's sort of living the paradox of sort of always arriving, always being there, and always arriving.
Yeah.
Like any good marriage is always about being there, being married, but always arriving. There's something living, dynamic, ever unfolding.
Well, and I think even as the journey of an individual on their spiritual journey can have a kind of honeymoon period. They can have awakenings, they can have realizations, and then you want to kind of bask in that. You want to kind of marinate in that, and that's pretty normal, like a honeymoon. But eventually, reality rears its head and, says, hello, here I am, a child or a dog or a job or whatever we have that we have to kind of work through. We have to come back down to earth. We have to leave Hawaii and come back to Ohio or wherever you're living, and California, and live our lives, And then what happens with the romance, with the romantic kind of movie ending, of they lived happily ever after? What happens after that? And I think as a movement, for lack of a better word, or as a kind of non-dual kind of scene or whatever you want to call it, it has its own process of maturing. And I think collectively now, people are realizing, so far the emphasis has been, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. And that's great, Before there's a marriage, you have to fall in love, right? I mean, that's sort of, that's the way it works. The little rhyme, remember? First comes John, then comes Mary, then comes somebody in a baby carriage.
A marriage.
Yeah. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes somebody in a
John
baby
and Mary come after the marriage.
Yeah, that's true.
Not always.
Yeah. Yeah. No, not always.
Not always.
Yeah, I had a few people in my family that had that. But I think collectively, as a movement, the non-dual spirituality craze or whatever, at first was pointing a lot toward awakening, and rightly so, and understandably so. You know,
because
first
so many
comes
people
love.
had slaved away so long in all sorts of spiritual disciplines without actually having that a really fundamental shift. And so a different style of teaching comes along that's very good at inducing the very shift that so many people were looking for. And I think that's why it was so powerful, because it comes along and goes, okay, you might have been at this at 20 years, or you might have just walked in the door tonight, but guess what? It really doesn't matter. And it opens a door of possibilities. I think that's why it sort of took off like this wildfire, right? Because you didn't necessarily have to subscribe
Right.
to a whole litany of preconditions.
Right.
Yeah.
And so people woke up. A lot of people have woken up. There's probably a number of people here who have had some kind of an awakening. And that's great. But then Monday morning comes, the alarm goes off. Where's your awakening now? What do you do with it afterwards? And that's why I was so intrigued to meet Adya for several years, because he was one of the teachers that I felt, I have to say, one of the few that I felt was saying, hey, there's life after awakening. It's not all about awakening. Awakening's important. You need that transcendent moment that hopefully becomes even more than a moment. And yet, that does not, like you said in your teaching the other night, that does not guarantee, for example, emotional maturity.
Or relational maturity.
Or any kind of...
Any kind of maturity, yeah.
So I think that's kind of where we're at now. I think we're at this point, we're at a crossroads. And with any crossroads, it happened in the Roman Catholic Church with Vatican II. You know, you have a crossroads, you have a point of sort of no return. Things have developed along a certain line. There's all kinds of exciting new possibilities. And what do some people do? They hunker down and they say, no, we want to keep it the way it is. We know what that's like. We want that. We know that. We understand that. We get that. Let's not go anywhere else. Let's just stay here. But you know what? Anything alive, you can't do that. You can't stay there in a marriage. You can't stay there in a relationship of any kind, in a friendship, in a job, you know, in your relationship to some issue. Anything that's a living reality is always going to be changing and developing. And the same with awakening. I think a lot of people were pointing to awakening as a kind of done deal. You know, I've run across several groups that I've been asked to speak at and had interaction with, and one in particular, which will remain nameless, of course, but a lot of people were talking about people being done. You know, oh, they're done. And I was like, what? Do you stick a fork in them? What do you do? You know? Right. So everybody's talking about people being done. Oh, John, oh, he's done. He's been done for 4 years. You know? Right. Alicia, she's been done 20 years, and he just got done 2 weeks ago, you know? And I was thinking, what the hell are they talking about? Done, you know? And yet, there was such an emphasis on the kind of entrance into clarity, which is by no means a done deal. It's a beginning, it's an entrance, it's walking into a doorway. And yet that was the emphasis. And I think now people have lived in doneness for a few years, and they realize, maybe I'm not so done as I think I am. Yeah. You know, maybe there's a few things left to be done. And I thought it was great the other night when you were talking about emotional maturity, not that that you could have the deepest awakening in the world, and we've all seen examples of this, I think, very notable ones, which again will remain nameless, but very notable ones over the years, over the last, 3 decades, of people who had great clarity, great awakening, were wonderful teachers in some ways, and their lives were a complete mess. You know, their personal relationships, their marriages, all 7 of them, were none of them were anything to write home about, And they may have had great clarity, but the emotional maturity level was maybe not so high. And I think that all these questions are really becoming important to people.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, yeah. Because also, I think we're living in a time where, obviously, for lack of a better word, mysticism, which is just the deeper esoteric teachings of religion, I guess, mysticism has broken out of its strict bonds with religion. It can still exist within religion, but it also it's sort of breaking out of those boundaries. And yet, so much of the mysticism of almost every tradition has developed within certain parameters, right, which are different than parameters of today. I mean, today, especially if you're young today, people grow up with this very imminent, very real sense of, we could actually screw this thing up so bad that none of us are going to be around anymore. That's not a theory anymore. Even when I was in college, it was like, well, we could blow ourselves up, us and the Russians going at it, but it was kind of like, well,
It's not likely.
it'll be terrible, it's not so likely, and somebody will survive, And it's a different atmosphere now. And so one of the things I've noticed that I think is really quite interesting is I rarely meet somebody that's 30 years old and below and younger that entertains the kind of the same spiritual vision that people of my generation, people before my generation envisioned, which is I almost never meet a young person today that even conceives of a kind of awakening or enlightenment that is relevant to them if it's in any way divorced from their life. That's really different, even from my generation, and different from the generations before that. There were exceptions, of course, to that rule. There always are. But as a whole, that's a huge sea change. Is that I meet young people all the time, and man, unless that concept, much less the experience of awakening or enlightenment, unless it includes a really wise and meaningful way to participate in the world and all of its challenges, it's just not relevant to them. It doesn't make any sense to them. And that's different. That's an evolution. That's something that esoteric spirituality is. Here we are in a room. We're all coming to grips with that, and it's altering itself in subtle ways to meet that new landscape, as it's probably done for millennia. It's always changed as culture and situations have changed. This is nothing new. It's just that what we're now experiencing is a little bit different, I think.
Yeah, I think like a lot of retreats I give, I talk to people about their experience, or they come to me and talk about their experiences. And I Skype with many people almost every day, and so I talk to a lot of people about their experiences. And even as a monk, I was a spiritual director, and I talked to a lot of people about their spiritual experiences. And many people have had experiences of oneness, at least momentary experiences of oneness or bliss or feeling kind of connected to everything. And that's great, and that's maybe one way of talking about awakening. But I think it's time for us now to reflect, what are the implications of this sense of oneness? How do I live that in my daily life? How do I live that as a postmodern person of the 21st century? How do we address terrorism from a perspective of oneness? Mm-hmm. How do we address the environment? If we really are one with everything, how do we live that? How does the rubber hit the road, so to speak? Mm-hmm. And I think all my life, even as a monk and doing spiritual direction with people and working with novices and different things I did, I was always kind of a spiritual pragmatist. Yeah. I was like, kind of show me the money guy. Mm-hmm. And even today, if I have students, they tell me about some big experience, and a lot of times people will be very excited. They'll want to make an appointment with you. They have a session, or they'll be on retreat, and maybe they had a kind of opening, and they will, want to tell you about it, and that's all great. And I'm not denigrating that. I'm not saying that those experiences aren't important, and I had many in my life, and I continue to have different kind of insights, openings. But what I will often ask somebody if they tell me about their experience, and I ask them, well, when did this happen to you? Well, 2 weeks ago, a month ago, 5 years ago. Some people will recount experiences that happened to them 20 years ago, that were just earth-shattering for them. And okay, you honor that. You kind of, you give that its due. That's important. But my question always is, what has it done for you lately? How did that experience express itself through you this week? Mm-hmm. Give me an example. And sometimes they can't. Mm-hmm. A lot of times they say, well, it was just a wonderful experience. I'm not sure how it's going to express itself through me. It hasn't really yet, too much. And it's like, well, that was 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think the natural trajectory of authentic spiritual experience, and all the spiritual masters, from John of the Cross to Meister Eckhart to Dzogchen masters to Zen masters to you name it, all the great spiritual masters of all the millennial traditions will say, what's important about a spiritual experience? The fruit. Mm-hmm. What's the result? What does it create? What's the trickle-down effect? An experience is a means to something. It's not an end in itself. If you want experiences that are very spiritual and inspiring and wonderful, you can take all kinds of drugs and have great experiences. Mm-hmm. And I'm not even saying that that's necessarily, I don't know enough about it. So don't pull me into that of various shamanistic drugs and things, I don't know, maybe so. But what I'm trying to emphasize is that experience in itself is not the point. Mm-hmm. It's what happens in a human life. How does that experience transform and transmute a human life? Mm-hmm. In this case, a human life. Mm-hmm. We're all humans, I think.
Yeah. Well, it's going back to the metaphor of the marriage. Right? A marriage is not even in marriage, but even a love affair or a friendship for that matter. They're not ultimately defined primarily by the peak moments. They're defined by all the moments in between the peak moments, right? Because even somebody that's a complete monster can have really great peak moments. Or somebody that's really terrible to live with, at moments they can be quite wonderful. But the overall trajectory can be quite miserable. So whatever our peak moments, I think they show us a fundamental reality. But I think, like you say, it's the trickle-down effect. And that's where I think it depends a lot on our sincerity, our honesty. It depends on what we want out of all this. If spirituality is ultimately an escape, which, of course, for a lot of people, that's where they start, because they're suffering so much, they just want an escape, and that's totally reasonable. But if it only ends up to be about an escape, it can only take you so far. Right? You'll stall out. And so I think it always comes back to not only what we want out of it, why we're doing it, but also how deeply we're paying attention to our own revelation. So I've always found that inherent within any moment of revelation, there's the experiential part, which is often uplifting and lovely and revelatory. But there's always, it seems to me, there's always been this other quiet part to every kind of revelatory experience. It's like some little whisper that you can hardly hear that just says, okay, now go out and live it. And that's a challenge. And what does that mean? And can we even endeavor to look at what that means without having a bunch of preconceived ideas of what it's going to mean? Do you know what? Because then we're just trying to come up to a saintly image, and that's another bit of nonsense too.
Yeah. And also to realize that it's just not automatic.
Right.
You know, like you're
Far
teaching
from it.
about emotional maturity, it's that there's no guarantee that you can have a full-blown, really knock your socks off awakening, you know, comparable to the Buddha under the Bodhi tree or something. And there's no guarantee that that means you'll be an emotionally mature and integrated person. You know, Ken Wilber has these lines of development teaching about how somebody can be really far along on one line, and on another line they can be very deficient. You know, I'm a good example in a way, on one level, because I was a monk for so long. So here I was, you know, I went to the monastery at the age of 22. I was in seminary right out of high school, which is a fairly kind of cloistered environment in itself, although not as much as a Trappist monastery. But then I go into the monastery, so I'm sort of living this secluded monastic life for many years, and I came out for various reasons to take care of parents and things like that. But even then, I was in a kind of religious context as a religious and still doing ministry or something that was, you know, an identification with that role. Here I was, you know, in a completely different context, and in many ways, a very mature person. I mean, I had had a lot of responsibilities, I had done teaching, I had preached, I'd done pastoral ministry to the dying, I'd done all kinds of things that developed me in different ways. I'd done intensive spiritual practice, had had kind of openings and awakenings, but when it came time to pay my taxes, I was clueless. I was like, what do I do? How do I keep track of all this? You know, and that's the way it can be for all of us, you know. We can develop very deeply along one line, and that does not guarantee that we're going to be developed along another line. And I think people are kind of, in the whole non-dual spiritual scene, people are beginning to get that. You know, they've had a teacher, or they've had a friend, or they themselves have had an amazing awakening, you know. Just amazing, with all kinds of clarity. Maybe there's Shakti flowing out of them that just awakens everybody that gets within 10 feet of them, you know? And yet, in their relationship, they can't decide who takes out the trash, you know? It's just, so there's no guarantee. Awakening does, I think, I know, it does help a lot on those levels. It does, yeah. But we're still an active participant in that trickle-down effect. You know, and maybe you could talk a little bit about your whole idea about coming to emotional maturity, at least a bit of it. I mean, it's actually, I was very impressed because he's doing this teaching on, what's the name of the whole teaching thing you're doing?
The Way of Liberating Insight, I think.
Yeah.
Is that right? Thank you. I need a whole room to come up with one coherent thought.
Well, what I like about it is he's doing it. How often do you do it again now? Every Wednesday.
Every other week.
Every other week for like 4 months.
Yeah.
So he's going very deeply into all these aspects of the path, and also about emotional maturity and how we really have to take the insight we have and then really reflect on that, really interiorize it, and live it, and actually live it in the world, and that's where it has its effect. That's where it bears its fruit in a human life.
Because that's where we come up with the stumbling blocks. So many of them are stumbling blocks. Yes, they're conceptual, but they're also deeply emotional.
Sure.
You know, I mean, all of a sudden you uncover some fear, some irrational fear that you don't really understand, or some awkwardness, or some situation that elicits some kind of anger, rage, something, you know, that's irrational. But those very areas that we're emotionally stuck are exactly the areas that the awakened consciousness can't get into and function through and express itself through until those kind of places are opened up. They're literally like blocking the access gates, you know? And I think that at a certain point we just, you know, we all come to this with our own kind of idealism, right? And that's great. But we also, you know, even the most resistant among us, you know, at some point we do start to see like, oh, okay, if I really want to start to live this, not in some perfected way. I always think that's the enemy of living it, is all the images of what we think it's going to look like, which are usually so otherworldly that, you know, Buddha couldn't even live up to them. why I always tell people, if you want a perfect guru, choose a dead one, because you can make anything out of them you want. You know, the living ones, you're stuck with them just the way they are.
And dead ones never even burp.
They never burp. They never
They
go
don't
to the
go
bathroom.
to the bathroom?
No, that's right. They never leave the toilet roll empty. You know.
Never leave the toilet lid up.
Right. Get married. It'll cure you of that very fast. Anyway. But
We'll see about that.
I feel like, I don't know about you, but I feel like we've made a good beginning. Maybe let's see what people have to question and see where they want to take this.